Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you the final part of our topic concerning the Battle of the Somme in 1916. This has been our first major battle that we've assessed in the war, and now we're going to go through it today and discuss our findings. What did we learn in our previous three videos on the lesson? And of course, discovering what the battle was like, what it was like for the soldiers, and of course, really assessing how successful was it, both for, of course, the leadership and of course the soldiers who took part in it. As always, important to stress this is a lesson catered towards the student level, so the content provides key knowledge and some practice of historical skills that we can put to the test. Therefore, do remember that of course this is for the student level, and because of that, if you would like some more deeper, in-depth reading, do check out the description box below, where I leave all my further readings that we've used throughout this series to, of course, understand about the Somme. With that in mind, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin our final part on the Battle of the Somme. So we should of course have studied the previous three videos and come to an understanding of what the campaign actually was like. We've now gathered the whole picture. We understand what the build-up was when Haig and of course the soldiers took part in the conflict and prepared for the campaign in early 1916. We have of course the events of the first day, the initial huge losses that were suffered and many mistakes that were made across the whole line of the front, albeit with some success occurring in the southern sector. And then we assessed the whole impact of the conflict going into the later months, into the rest of the campaign by the time we get to September, October, and November of 1916. And so we finished all our content there. We should have that gathered and ready to use, and that's what we're going to go and use in our point forward here. So a key historical debate that underpins this battle is one that essentially concerns the wider parts of the war. We have to understand that for many historians, this was a Pyrrhic victory, that this was the first real test of attritional war for the British. And while there were indeed some big successes, taking the land, managing to relieve the French at Verdun by, of course, distracting many of the German soldiers and churning many of them down, as we said, over 500,000 Germans were killed in this campaign alone. The issue still remains that for historians, there were still lots of problems that were highlighted in this conflict. One of the most famous of them is Alan Clark, a politician turned historian in the 1960s, and he created the donkey thesis. Literally, his whole book was called The Donkeys, and he espoused this idea that the generals were donkeys, the likes of Haig and Rawlinson and others. They were donkeys, they were fools, and they led the lions of the British men, these recruits in the PAL battalions who were brought through, and they effectively sent them to their deaths. They would have foolish, blundering, bumbling leadership. One of the historian, John Laffin, calls them outright bunglers. He believes that the British leadership was outright terrible and created many problems, many issues for the soldiers. And again, there's some merit to this issue as we encountered, especially with that first day. It's quite easy to blame the likes of Haig for what happened at the Somme. We have to understand that thousands of soldiers did die. That first defeat at the Somme on July 1st still remains, even now in the 21st century, the greatest single defeat of the British Army across all of its history for a single day of combat. Thousands of young men lost their lives. Many of them were psychologically scarred after this battle. There were over 55,000 casualties that were suffered, in addition to those who were killed and lost during the day of combat. And we, in essence, have a massive problem for the British leadership. Maybe indeed they are right to be characterized as donkeys because of what happened. However, this fixation on the first day overlooks the rest of the campaign that we discovered. And so we as historians, we have to go beyond what the likes of Clark and Laffin did and really ask ourselves, is this a fair judgment? Can we cast this over just Haig? Or actually, can we actually assign blame to other leaders or even success? Is there not proof that the soldiers actually adapted? And so in line with this is for more so the A-level students now, as we look beyond that first day, we have to ask ourselves what's called criteria questions. What does that mean? Well, it means when we frame our essays, we frame our discussions and debates as historians, we need to prove with the evidence that we've gathered that our interpretation is convincing and can be substantiated. So one way that we can do that is to ask ourselves the key question: did the British Army, the soldiers and the leadership actually adapt as we went beyond that first day and discovered what happened? Were there any key changes? And in doing that, we ask ourselves, did the British Army actually transform? So, first off, did it actually change? How did it change, if so? And did the British Army actually improve? And this is where we have to do what's called a change over time styled question. We ask ourselves, okay, let's look at the British Army just before the campaign began in June into July of 1916, and then assess them at the end of it when we get to November, December of 1916. In that 5 to 6 month span, did they actually change? Did they improve? So let's, of course, assess that. Let's split this up into some criteria points. So the first way we can look at this is, as I say, to go right back to July 1916. So each of the prompts here are potentially a paragraph or theme that you can look into. I'll, of course, just give you a highlight of some of the 5 key points that we can look at. First off, in July 1916, we have to understand the British were a novice force. As we established way back in my first video, most of the original BAF have been sadly killed or became casualties after the failures at Aubers Ridge lose in 1915. And so the men we have here going into the Somme, they were a novice force. They were civilian men, they were villagers, they were townsfolk, many of them quite young. Many never really held rifles. When they initially were training, there wasn't really the technology or the equipment for them to use. Many trained in their own civilian clothes. They did not have access to the equipment you would expect a finely tuned army to have. And so we have to bear that in mind when we go into the Somme. This was their first combat. This is the first problem that they had, in that they were just simply inexperienced. This is no fault of their own. These were men who were not expecting to spend their young lives fighting in a war. Many of them, as we said, expected an adventure. They were just thought, as I say, it would be home by Christmas, 6 weeks, a few months, and expect to be here waiting in the mud, cycling in those dark, deep trenches, going out to fight in this war. Another theme we can assess is the actual technology that the soldiers really used in the battle in those early days. So when we established on that first week into the first day of initial combat for the infantry, the shells and the artillery was quite lackluster. When the leader, General Rawlinson, ordered this week-long bombardment and over 1 million shells were fired across that week, there was a real overconfident belief that it would work. It would absolutely destroy the German position. There'd be no issues, and they could simply just march out their trenches, walk across the land, and occupy the space without much issue. But as we said, the bombing did not succeed because the German trenches, they were well fortified, they had strong pillboxes, they had deep, secure bunkers, and above all, the artillery actually failed. There were many duds, some of them only snarled up barbed wire. The actual use and range of them was still being tested. It wasn't a really proper kind of barrage of attack, it wasn't coordinated. It was just a relentless firing. It didn't work, and we have to accept that reality. There was a big problem here on that first initial use in combat. The other point, this links to the first paragraph, but it's the actual infantry themselves. And the sad truth of it is they were not well coordinated. We had some officers being told they would be allowed to tell their men to walk across the land, others requesting them to be more cautious, hiding in shell holes. We had some given masses of equipment, weighing them down with 200 rounds of ammunition, carrying mill bombs, shovels, even sandbags. They were very difficult to run and very difficult to move. But then, likewise, we had some in the southern sector who were moving, who were running, were carrying light, were pushing through sap trenches, were conducting skirmishing raids, and did have more success on that first day of combat. So it's a very, very mixed bag for the infantry at that time. And this, of course, is coupled with the fourth point, which is the officers. Many of them were felt constrained, some especially in the Ulster divisions, were seeking permission from higher ups the divisional command to change tactics on the ground, to conduct initial retreats. It just wasn't very flexible, and this was a big problem for them. And a big one we can't overlook is another technological flaw, which is the tanks were not here yet. They were not in use, they were not yet even fully developed. They they just weren't here. And this lack of a key machine of war was going to be felt on this first day, especially one, as we'll see in a bit, became quite key later on in the campaign. So that's the situation for the British Army in 1916. But what was the situation for them at the end? Did they change? Did they adapt? Did they improve? And in answer to that question, I think the answer could be yes. So straight away, they grew in competency across the whole campaign. The army became battle hardened. They were now more experienced soldiers. They conducted trench raids. They were better shooters with their rifles. They were used to the strains of combat. Of course, don't get us wrong. It was still a very psychologically straining thing to conduct themselves in, but the experience gained from conducting combat, from becoming used to the daily waves and flow of combat, skirmishing regularly, getting used to the mill bombs, better with their rifles, it all gradually pays off. So we can't forget that. This was now a force that had gone over 5, 6 months of combat and really had learned a lot in that time. Another part now was, of course, the change in tactics and development of technology. Artillery was being better developed. They actually were now coordinating its use and coupling it with infantry movements rather than this whole separate campaign of, right, first fire with the artillery, stop, then let the infantry come in. They would now work them together through the use of a creeping barrage, more pace, explosive attacks, while the infantry can move in under the protection of the shadow of the barrage. And then when the barrage moved on, they could then help into the trench and take the Germans by surprise in the initiative. Suddenly it wouldn't matter that the German Somme defences were so well fortified because they were being so relentlessly hit. And it also must be stressed that as the campaign's going on, what's going to happen to the German trenches? They're going to suffer damage. Eventually, yes, they're fortified right at the start, they can take quite a whack, but as the campaign's going on, sections are going to fall down and be destroyed. As we see at Thiepval, a key stronghold position that eventually falls later on in the campaign post September and beyond. And that's a simple belief of the attritional strategy actually working. Just keep pushing, keep pressing, and eventually the Germans will concede. Because as we said, they're on the defensive. They have no real means of stopping the British attack, because to attack would give up their defensive advantage, and that's something they cannot risk. Yes, they would do counterattacks, they would use reserves to retake lost positions, lost line trenches, but as long as the British and French kept pushing, kept punching into their position, eventually it would crack, and it did. Another key change was the officers became more flexible. They learned from their mistakes, even as quick as the first week of combat. After the initial fails on the first day, Rawlinson began conducting trench raids. He began making sure soldiers skirmish rather than stay in the line formation. So change was becoming quite evident, and we can't overlook that. And the final part is tanks were now used. Yes, there were big problems for them. The first initial 40 or so that were used in that campaign in September, they did break down, they did get stuck in the mud. But where they did work, as I say, they became these metal monsters the Germans feared. They would write about to their superiors, panic about how could they defeat them. The machine guns are worthless. This metal monster just keeps charging, blasting its cannons, or firing its own Vickers guns. There's nothing they can do. And this, as we'll see in later campaigns, is only going to grow in importance and become a key technology the British will make not just more use of, but more success with as well. For all intents and purposes, we could consider that campaign attack in September as the first sign of combined arms, where we see artillery, infantry, and tanks being used together to quite a bit of success. Now we have to close this out then of our 4 video campaign here and really assess for ourselves as historians, did this campaign actually work? Can we call the Somme Offensive a success in 1916? And we established there's various criteria to do that. You can look at soldiers themselves, how they grew and developed as a force from those days in July right to the end in November. You can look at technology, the use of tanks, the use of artillery, how they developed, how they improved, and for the sake of the tank, actually were finally used in combat. You also have tactical developments, the abandoning of slow line formations to use for more unanimous skirmishing attacks, a bit more wave and flow, reliance on trench raids, going out at night or later on in the morning rather than in the bright of day, fresh and ready to attack. And you also have, above all, the creeping barrage, this now innovative tactic that was going to prove successful and did gather them success and become a key staple of the army as we go forward. And this one connects with the second question, but also the change in the officer class as well. As I said, Clarke's thesis has evolved into something of a myth in British popular culture. When people think of the war, they tend to think of Clarke's Donkey's thesis and probably Blackadder goes forth. While brilliant comedy, it's not necessarily the accurate portrayal of the conflict that we should fall into. When they say this is what the war is really like, it's really what the war was like at certain moments. It was not a blanket statement for the whole war. And this is why, with our criteria as historians, we should look across the whole timeline. Yes, we can look at turning points like that first day and see, yeah, this was a big failure for the British. But it was also, as Gary Sheffield says, another historian, a learning curve for the British. A turning point not necessarily into defeat, but how they could learn from mistakes and overcome them, adapt, transform, and improve as a British Army. And that links to the final key question that I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments, which is, to what extent can we say the British Army truly transformed? Did they become an effective fighting source in 1916? As said, they were a novice, if confident force at the start of the campaign. By November, can we say they had improved and become more competent, more capable? So there's some historical questions to consider. One thing I do want to remind us of, though, and it can't be overstated, despite our actions to look at the full picture and have a judgment that considers all criteria and the entire campaign, there's one grim reality we can't overlook, and that is over 1 million men across the British, French, and the German troops all lost their lives in this campaign. And we can't forget that sad reality. Despite whatever defense we might say, these are mass losses that were suffered. However, can the deaths of millions of men truly ever be deemed an acceptable loss? And there we are. That's the conclusion for our lesson here on the Somme. Thank you for taking part across not just this lesson, but the whole 4 series on it. I hope you've learned a lot about it. I hope you found it quite insightful. And for you students out there, mine included, who have been watching this, I hope you found it quite useful. And I hope you join us for our following lesson, where we delve into the next key battle for the British in the conflict, which will take us back to Ypres and the third battle that occurred there, and Passchendaele in 1917. But all in all, thank you for listening. Thank you for taking part. I hope to hear from you all soon. If you want any further reading, it is still in the description box below, once I've used in this lesson and beyond. So do, of course, give those a read if you would like to learn more. Thank you once again for watching. Thank you once again for listening. I look forward to seeing my class again. Thank you for listening.